All right, welcome back for our final panel of the day. This is a great panel. It's called Ransomware Rages On, Best Practices and Pitfalls for Corporates and Other Organizations. So we have three terrific panelists. Let me introduce quickly first Sara Goldstein, who's a partner at BakerHostetler in Philadelphia. She advises hundreds of clients from a variety of different industries on responding to cybersecurity and data privacy incidents, including several of the largest data breaches to date. Prior to joining BakerHostetler, Sara was the vice president and general counsel of the nation's second largest provider of release of information and disclosure management services. Welcome, Sara.
Thank you.
I'm very pleased to next introduce Jack Hughes, head of digital forensics and incident response in Europe for Unit 42. He's based in the UK. Jack conducts corporate forensic investigations and performs cyber incident response engagements globally in accordance with the Association of Chief Police Officers Digital Evidence Guidelines and the NIST frameworks. And he specializes in investigating and defending against cybersecurity breaches and managing forensic lab operations. Prior to joining Unit 42, he worked at a global intelligence cybersecurity consultancy where he led the cyber incident response teams. Welcome, Jack.
Thank you very much, Bruce.
Finally, I'm very pleased to introduce our moderator today, Nikki Friedlander. She's a partner at Sullivan and Cromwell based in New York. She is a member of the firm's criminal defense and investigations group, but also co-head of its cybersecurity practice. She advises major corporations and boards of directors in cybersecurity planning and incident response. And Nikki was previously chief of the complex frauds and cybercrime unit in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. Great to have you with us, Nikki, and welcome.
Thanks so much, Bruce. Thanks for having us all.
Thank you. We turn it over to you.
Shall we jump right in? I don't know if we've seen Beck's video yet.
Yes, please.
Okay, great. Sara, Jack, thanks so much for joining us. So jumping right in, our title is Ransomware Rages On, and we'd love to hear what you are seeing in your practices in terms of the current threat landscape. Jack, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much, Nikki. So we get to respond to more than 1,300 incidents every year. And as we've detailed on our reporting this year, approximately 40% of those incidents have been ransomware. We've also seen that the ransoms being demanded by the threat actors have increased, with the average now being about $2.2 million. Unfortunately, what we have continued to see is a lack of basic security controls being established holistically across environments is enabling threat actors to gain easy access to the networks. These incidents we responded to over the last year have had three major initial access points, which were unresolved vulnerabilities existing for large periods of time, brute forcing of credentials, and especially where there isn't multi-factor authentication in place, and then being followed quite closely by phishing. And these three are the major initial points that we're seeing across the threat landscape at the moment.
Sara, is that consistent with what you're seeing? We'd love to know what's new in the landscape in your practice.
Sure. So we have certainly continued to see ransomware attacks across the many matters that we've handled in 2022. But I will say that we have seen somewhat of a decrease in the number of ransomware attacks. And there's a variety of reasons why people think this may be happening. Some attribute this to the conflict in the Ukraine and the fact that threat actors are actually fighting in a war and focusing their attacks on the Ukraine and not so much for monetary gain. Others say that because there's been so much more heightened attention to these types of attacks from law enforcement and governments around the world, that there may be some spooked threat actors. And so they're going into other types of cybercrime, whether it be fraudulent wire transfer, phishing. But I will say since August, we've definitely seen an increase in the number of ransomware attacks, and consistent with what Jack's seeing, increased demands, and again, the same attack vectors. Some things that we have seen notably are much more sophisticated social engineering techniques that are being utilized by threat actors to trick people into gaining credentials and gaining access to systems, whether it is for ransomware attacks or for extortion. They're doing much more research. They're also reaching out to family members and friends and customers and other affiliated entities with companies to assert pressure. As I mentioned earlier about some pivoting of some criminal activity, we've really seen an uptick in fraudulent wire transfer incidents, which we like to think of as more of like an old school crime. These things used to happen more frequently 5 years ago, and we've seen them raging. And it could be because it's an easier crime to do. We also have heard from the Secret Service that there may be an increase because so much data has been stolen as a result of ransomware attacks that people can pick and choose. They can find an invoice, manipulate the invoice, create a spoofed email address, and then convince someone to pay them funds using the manipulated invoice. And the last piece, and I'm sure many on the call can relate to this, is there's definitely been a hardening of the cyber insurance market. In the wake of all of the cyber attacks that have occurred in 2020 and 2021, we've seen it much harder for organizations to get cyber insurance, and cyber insurance companies issuing many more surveys, as well as doing their own scanning of environments. And then when you can get cyber insurance, your retention is higher, your deductible is higher, and your limits may be lower than you'd like.
Yeah. Can I ask you both a follow-up question on one point you both raised? You're seeing higher demands. Are you seeing less flexibility from the perpetrators in terms of negotiating down? Or do you find that they're starting higher and they're as flexible as they used to be?
I mean, I would say that we're definitely still seeing some flexibility as part of that, but they are still as the initial asks are being so much higher. It tends to be that when there are payments, that they do tend to be in the higher regions, and there's still an increase on what we've seen previously as well.
I would agree.
Jack, I know you have said the best thing you can do to respond effectively to a ransomware attack is prepare in advance. And I'd love to hear more about that. What do you mean, and what do you recommend companies do?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about preparation, it's got to be holistic in nature. And what that means is that organizations have got to look at their approach to responding to an incident through their people, their processes, and their technology. I think that the single best thing that an organization can do at the moment is retain an incident response provider up front. And the reason for that is that the providers offer assessments like incident response plans, like ransomware readiness assessments, as we're on the topic of ransomware. These assessments, they first look at the processes and procedures an organization currently has in place, such as their backup policies, their disaster recovery plans, incident response plans, and also the technical controls that are in place. They can then effectively devise tabletop exercises, which can be used to both exercise and assess the current readiness of the organization to respond to those incidents. More advanced readiness assessments can also use technology being deployed across the organization to look for threats of ransomware already existing within the organization. And even more advanced assessments can use things like purple teaming to really help the organization mature their ability to respond to those incidents. So what I really want to elaborate on there is that when we think about preparation, it has to be holistic. It can't focus on one sole aspect. And we must also make sure that that preparation is repeated frequently, as it's not a one-time operation.
That's interesting. It's always helpful, I think, for people to hear examples. And so not to put you on the spot, but are there incidents you worked on where you observed that, like, had the company done some of the things in advance that you just talked about, it would have been much easier to deal with the attack?
Absolutely. And I think one of the easiest ways of me being able to bring that to light is to use logging as an example. When we respond to incidents, two of the major questions that we get asked are how the organization was initially breached and what information was accessed or even potentially exfiltrated by the threat actor. Now, both of these questions require that an organization has already enabled an adequate level of logging, both at a verbosity level and also be holding them for a sensible period of time. When we know the dwell time of a threat actor sitting in a network with access is approximately 30 days prior to deploying ransomware, but an organization is only currently potentially maintaining their logs for 7 days, and that's definitely saying that it's on the longer side of the curve in some instances, it makes it extremely difficult for us to be able to answer those questions, and if not sometimes impossible, because if the data's not there, then we can't review it and provide the answers that we're being asked.
Makes sense. Sarah, I'm sure you've seen that too.
Most definitely.
A question for you, Sarah. Companies often ask, what does the response actually look like? What does the experience look like for the non-technical employees of a company, the lawyers, in-house counsel, the business people? Can you give us an insider's view on what it looks like? And since this is about best practices and pitfalls, maybe you could tell us what you think they should or they shouldn't be doing.
Sure. So the incident response process, there are so many moving pieces, and the pieces are moving all on parallel tracks. And so it can be very overwhelming to folks who have not prepared in advance. And I cannot stress enough what Jack was saying about being prepared. It really will help with the outcomes in terms of how quickly you're able to get back up and running, as well as to determine what the scope of the impact of the incident was. So that's why it's crucial to get to know who's on the incident response team. They need to meet frequently or on some sort of regular basis, and they need to conduct the tabletop exercises to simulate scenarios. There's a lot of really good action items that come out of those. Without that, it can be a little unwieldy, especially since you're dealing in a crisis and you may be working with law firms and forensic investigation firms and other vendors that you've never met before, and it's difficult to build trust in a time of crisis. So advanced preparation is really key. I think some things that people have to keep in mind when they're dealing with an incident really relates around communications and the rumor mill and protecting the interests of the organization. One thing that surprises a lot of folks is that threat actors are often monitoring emails. So utilizing the corporate email tenant, at least temporarily, is don't use it until you get the all clear from the forensic investigators that we don't have a situation there. I have heard, though this is not my personal experience, so this is secondhand, that a threat actor was monitoring email and was actually able to join a Zoom call between the client, privacy counsel, and forensic investigation firm, and reiterated their threats. It was just not a good look for everyone. So we want to avoid that. So ideally, communications about this are done orally and not in writing. So there's a lot of phone calls and it's around the clock. So to the extent that you can identify the folks that are going to be heavily involved in the incident response in advance, that helps, as opposed to perhaps bringing in way too many people and not being an effective way of handling it. But developing a relationship with the vendors, whether it's privacy counsel or forensics, that will help guide you through the process, is critical, because they are going to help you see around corners and help guide you through this process.
I was really interested, Sarah, in your point about the group, getting to know the group that's going to be responding. Something I personally see, I don't know if this is consistent with your experience, is like companies, when I first speak with them about ransomware, tell me, well, if we have an attack, we plan to involve, we want to make sure everybody's on the same page. And so we plan to involve in the inner circle, some very large group of people. What is your advice for companies on who's in the inner circle, or how big is the inner circle? And by inner circle, I mean those who know exactly what is going on in terms of the nature of the attack, the consequences, how it's being dealt with, and the like.
Sure. So there's different teams that are going to be involved in an incident response process. And there's going to be some highly sensitive conversations that are going to happen, especially around payment of a ransom demand. And so we want to make sure that those conversations are really limited, because what we have seen, unfortunately, is when too many people are in the room, is when we see leaks of information, especially if it's a high profile organization or company, to the media. And that can be very counterproductive, because then you're going to be utilizing resources to comment or respond to whatever is being posted. So there needs to be different teams working on different aspects of the incident response process, and not everyone should be working on everything together. And so there needs to be a structure in terms of the reporting chain to keep things organized, and so that we're not duplicating efforts, and that we're not wasting time.
That's really helpful. Jack, can I ask you, since Pitfalls is part of the title of our panel, I'll ask you both. Can we talk about some pitfalls for companies dealing with a ransomware attack? So setting aside lack of advanced preparation, which we talked a little bit about, what are some pitfalls? I'm interested to hear from both of you, but maybe we'll start with Jack. What are some pitfalls that you've seen?
Definitely. So I mentioned logging earlier as one small example, but a couple of other pitfalls I've seen frequently are organizations that don't enable their retained technical incident response team to perform the allocated tasks. And also organizations that, even when they've experienced a devastating ransomware attack, are not open to the possibility that they might have to do things differently in the future. A couple of examples on both of these. On the case of not enabling the team to perform the work, you get the teams that have some understanding of the technical analysis work that needs to be performed to investigate the incident, but they then engage an IR firm because they've reached the limitation of their technical ability or experience, but then they try to continue to respond to the incident rather than focusing on the recovery operations, which will at the end enable the organization to recover more efficiently from the incident. And these organizations have got to remember that we are there to help them. And then on the flip side of that, when we consider organizations that have experienced these types of attack but aren't open to change, when you've experienced a devastating ransomware attack but aren't willing to take some of the more drastic actions, and I say drastic and say like performing a global password reset to effectively contain and eradicate the threat actor's access to the network, it can be frustrating because you know that that recommendation, if not followed upon, is quite likely to be the cause of another breach again in the future.
And what do you think is the reason you see reluctance from some companies to take the steps after the fact that you think are important to take? Is it operational? Is it time? Is it money? Or, are these expensive changes you're suggesting? Why the reluctance?
Sometimes it can, so on the operational side, I think sometimes there's just a nervousness that as it's never been done before, they don't really understand the implications of what is actually going to happen when they hit that reset button. So I think operational, that tends to be more the issue than anything.
Sara, thoughts on pitfalls?
Sure. So I think one thing that is very frustrating is organizations in haste to get back up and running wipe really valuable evidence that's needed for the forensic investigation in an effort to get back up and running as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, especially if your company is in a highly regulated industry, the lack of evidence could result in a situation where you have to provide notification because you cannot rule out unauthorized access to or acquisition of personally identifiable or other sensitive information. And so you're notifying people, even though you don't necessarily have evidence that there was access or acquisition, you can't rule it out. And if you're highly regulated, that's the regulators would expect you to notify there. So that's a really unfortunate situation. It's also unfortunate because if depending on the evidence that's been lost, we may not be able to understand the attack vector or understand if there were vulnerabilities that resulted in the incident so that we could patch them or address them, leaving organizations vulnerable. So that's one. The other thing is providing inaccurate information and needing to walk it back, because that can be incredibly damaging to the organization. So one example that I saw was a company that provided cancer registry software. They notified all of their healthcare clients that they had a ransomware attack, that it involved all of their clients' data. And so numerous healthcare systems came to BakerHostetler, said, hey, we need to notify hundreds of thousands, millions of patients of this incident. It turns out that what was initially reported to these healthcare systems was not accurate. The software company said, hey, actually, we did some further analysis and not all of your data was implicated. And for these organizations to sort of trust this updated information and then further trust this organization to have a continuing relationship was really damaging. So there really is this knee-jerk instinct to be transparent, tell everyone everything you know, but you don't know a lot very early on. So you need to be very careful in your communications, because if you say something that turns out to be inaccurate, you can really do harm to your reputation and relationships by trying to walk that back.
That's a really good point. Let me ask you a follow-up question on the first point you made about wiping servers. I mean, companies so often are trying to clean servers to get them back online. They have operational impacts that put incredible time pressure on them to do that. how do you know, do they need to image all their servers? It's expensive. Like, how do they avoid inadvertently wiping what could be important evidence?
Yeah, and so that's part of the preparation piece. You have to have these conversations in advance about, okay, how would we preserve the evidence and what is our backup capability? And do we have enough storage to maintain these forensic images while we rebuild? Also, understanding where your most valuable systems and the systems that are critical to operations so that you can make sure that they can get back up and running the quickest. And then there can sometimes be a business decision that needs to be made that it's not going to be feasible for us to preserve this evidence, and we'd rather just notify than individuals than try to delay us get back up and running. And as long as people understand the operational and business risks associated with that, then that's fine. But you have to have those conversations and you have to do that data mapping, if you will, and do that preparation. And that's why it's so critical to make sure that you know the team that's going to be working with you following an incident.
Jack, is that something you've seen in responses, that companies inadvertently kind of make things worse by getting rid of critical data?
Definitely, and it's definitely on the inadvertent level as well, especially prior to sometimes actually an incident response firm having been engaged, and they try and take those quick actions to be able to quickly restore operations. That's absolutely something we see, and it's one of the things that when we have been engaged as an incident response firm, that we have to work with counsel to be able to identify what the requirements are for reporting afterwards, to then guide the organisation and try and give them recommendations and all the resources they can possibly need to ensure they can keep copies and preserve the information that they need for their reporting requirements.
Sara, let me give you one more follow-up on the points you made about the common knee-jerk reaction of companies to want to disclose because, and for any number of reasons, they have relationships with customers and counterparties. They're concerned about legal notification requirements. There's just I agree with you, a lot of pressure that on them to notify quickly, and they wind up saying more than is accurate sometimes. But I wondered, to what extent do you think that is a response to regulation and laws that increasingly require, at least here in the States, notification within 30 days or a week, and of course under GDPR even more quickly than that, and to the extent that's a legitimate concern, how would you advise companies that are navigating the risk of over-disclosure with the need to call their data protection authority quickly?
Sure. So I definitely think it is related to the new regulations with the really limited timelines, but it's also the culture that a lot of companies have, that they want their customers come first and they want to provide all available information to them as soon as it becomes available. And so the problem here is that in the beginning of an incident, a lot of information is not available. So if you wanted to provide more details, you're almost providing like hypotheses or possibilities. And so I think that the goal of the communications, obviously you're going to have to communicate, especially if you're experiencing an incident that has downstream impacts on your customers. So you need to be transparent, but you don't want to speak too early or speak on the fly and say something again that you're going to have to walk back. You don't want to be misleading. You also don't want to be too reassuring and make promises that you're not going to be able to keep. So it's a really fine balance. And one thing that we like to do proactively is prepare templates that could be used in terms of customer communications as to what we would say and how we would communicate it and what that cadence would look like, so that we're not creating everything from scratch right in the middle of the crisis. Some other things that we don't recommend ever communicating is that your organization is a victim. Even though we know your organization is a victim, it's not really, people don't like to hear that because it's their businesses that are impacted or their data that may be involved. Also, overstating the security measures that you had in place. Like, we had state-of-the-art security, but despite all of that, the threat actors got in. Also describing incidents as highly sophisticated. In my experience, most incidents are not highly sophisticated. There's a very simple reason for why they happened. So those are sort of the recommendations related to communications. It's a really fine balance.
That makes a lot of sense. How about when the operational impact to the company is very clearly visible to the outside world, and you're in a situation where you could have a lot of people calling, consumers calling, questions, and the company doesn't have answers. That's such a difficult situation, and I know you've seen it many times before. How do you navigate that?
Sure. So what a lot of clients opt to do is, to the extent their website is up, post some notice about we are experiencing technical issues and we're responding to them, and we'll provide updates on a regular basis. To the extent it's very customer facing, we've seen frequently scheduled Zoom calls to provide updates. We've also seen clients that prepare every other day updates to their customers. We've also seen clients proactively engage vendors to stand up call centers so that instead of utilizing the resources they have internally, which they may not, to address questions from consumers and others, that there is a resource that can be contacted with FAQs that would be used by the call center that could be updated frequently. So to the extent they have a question and we just don't have the answer, the people who are interested could always call back, and those the information is constantly updated as the investigation progresses.
How do you like call centers in that, very time pressured crisis situation of a ransomware attack? It's different when you're using them for, long after a data breach, and they have a whole list of, Q&A, and they're ready to receive a huge number of calls. Does it work as effectively in the time pressured situation of a ransomware attack, or is that something you use only in more limited circumstances?
It's usually utilized in much more limited circumstances, especially where there's a huge consumer base, and let's say email is not going to be the most effective way of reaching out to consumers. So it's not a typical, especially if you're not consumer facing, then we wouldn't generally use the call center, but there are circumstances where it could be helpful. It's not perfect, but at least you're creating an opportunity for folks to speak to someone and ask questions.
Mm-hmm. Jack, let me ask, in your experience, what is the hardest part of responding to a ransomware attack?
Yeah, so in my experience, the hardest part for organizations when responding to ransomware incidents is actually the overcoming of the emotions from those that are involved, especially the decision-making end of the operation. When your network's been compromised, when you've lost all of your information, emotions are an extremely high stake. And I think it's really important that the teams, and especially the operational teams, focus on the fact, and I know this is extremely difficult, that they can use these attacks as a positive experience and a catalyst for change for the future as well.
How often do you all see, because of the pressure employees are under, and maybe finger pointing that can happen kind of naturally, how often do you see during the attack emails get created or Slack messages or what have you that are unhelpful? Maybe this is a better question for Sara in the kind of litigation context, but how often are communications during the crisis themselves a cause for future problems for the company in disputes or litigation?
Yeah, so it definitely can happen, especially if folks are not prepared for what you can do and can't do during an incident, especially related to communications. It's also can be an issue where there are leaders that don't necessarily want to take the advice that they're being given by the experts and decide to go off on their own. And so there's a lot and say things that no one would ever advise them to say, and then having to conduct damage control. So it can certainly be very, very problematic. So we're always encouraging clients that when they're educating their workforce about responding to incident response, that limiting communications that are shared in writing, even text messages, are still discoverable. So that's not really helpful. And so that's why we try to have as many phone calls as possible to limit what's put in writing. But there's always the situation where someone puts something in writing that's not appropriate, and we just have to respond essentially and try to limit the liability that it may create.
Makes a lot of sense. Jack, are there tips you can share with the audience on, you talked about some of the hardest parts of responding to attacks, tips you can share on avoiding those problems?
Yeah, I think that was also a really good point to make around communications. And I think that going back to the emotion of some of these situations, that some of the communications and some of the expectations of the decision makers in these situations can sometimes be particularly unhelpful. Everyone's stressed, and especially in ransomware attacks, people tend to work extremely long hours to try and identify what's happened, trying to get the business back running as quickly as possible. I think that's one of the things that has to be looked upon, and preparation really helps that. But on the flip side of that, I think that using the positive experience as well, use this as the opportunity to upgrade your operating systems, get rid of all those vulnerabilities that have sat in your network for 2-3 years, if not more than that, and make sure you're using security technology to prevent these incidents from happening again. I think that whilst there's no particular silver bullet to preventing ransomware attacks from happening, and I'm going to come back to, taking the time to prepare now is going to make it so much easier to respond to and recover from one if you are unfortunate enough to experience a ransomware attack.
To what extent, Jack, are companies able to do the type of work you just described on their own, in your experience? I would think most companies not, but maybe even all companies not. Some companies are very large, have very sophisticated in-house information technology and cybersecurity departments. Some companies are themselves big technology companies, and I've had technology clients say, "Oh, we figure all this stuff out ourselves. We're the leading experts in the world in technology." How do you react to that?
No, we've definitely seen examples of where we've been and responded to similar incidents. And sometimes it's just some external perspective that's required on some of these situations to go, actually, the way you have been operating has worked up until now, but sometimes you've got to change, and sometimes you've got to change your approach to these situations, because if you don't, there's a risk that this could happen again. And I'm sure that nobody wants to be sat, and I'm sure that nobody on this call wants to be sat on a ransomware call trying to explain to their boss as to why it's happened and how they're going to recover from it.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I think it's very helpful to have an outside perspective, just as you said. I mean, it's not unlike if a doctor who has a serious medical problem of their own typically goes to see another physician, even if they're an expert. And I think there's some similarities, some parallels here. Okay, so a question I'm sure you both get all the time from companies: should they pay? And how do they decide? Can you tell us, in your experience, what drives the decision whether to pay? And if that's changed over time, I think that'd be interesting to hear as well. Sara, maybe we start with you.
Sure. So in my experience, there are two main factors that would drive a decision to pay or not to pay. The first is, does the organization have viable backups for the data that's been encrypted as a result of the ransomware attack? And if they do have viable backups, how long do they think it will take to recover? When a client does not have viable backups, either because the backups were encrypted by the malware or they were deleted by the threat actor, it's harder for them to not pay, because especially if it's critical and they can't reinvent the information, they're going to go out of business if they don't pay. Fortunately, we see that situation less and less these days, because organizations have seen what's happened to other companies and have properly segmented their backups and have redundancies in their systems. So they shouldn't have an issue with regard to not being able to restore from backups, which is good. We do sometimes see clients concerned, like, oh, it's going to take so many hours. We can just get the decryptor tool by paying. And one thing that surprises folks, and I'm sure Jack has seen this, is the decryptor tool from a threat actor is not a silver bullet. It's not like you just plug it in and it's going to work. It can take a really long time, sometimes longer than it would if you had just restored from your backups, to use a decryptor tool, especially for certain types of databases and other types of organizations of data. Sometimes a tool does not work. So that's one reason why someone would pay to get the decryptor tool. The second reason is the threat actor has acquired data, and based off of what forensics is seeing and maybe what the threat actor has provided as proof of exfiltration, the data is so sensitive, so valuable to the organization, that they are willing to pay a demand to prevent its disclosure, even though they know they're paying criminals and there's no guarantee that the data will not eventually be further disclosed at some point in time. That to them, it's a decision that they have to make it to protect whatever information they're concerned about. But what I think also surprises people, in addition to the decryptor tool not being a silver bullet, is just because you pay a demand and you get quote unquote assurances that the data has been deleted, that does not absolve you of any notification obligations you may have, whether under breach notification laws or contract, because there was ultimately acquisition of that data.
Follow-up question on that. Companies sometimes say, well, look, even if I have to make notification, don't I want to be able to tell my customers that I paid to get their data back? Isn't that important for our relationship with our customers? How do you think about that question?
So in my experience, it's not a crowd pleaser when you say that you've paid. It doesn't bring comfort to folks. People's response typically is like, well, so what? They're criminals. They have my data. They might also respond by saying, well, that's why whatever industry you're in is so expensive. Your services are so expensive. You should have spent this money to have better safeguards in place. So it's not really a great PR point. We've also heard, though I've not personally experienced this, potential cyber insurance coverage because you're disclosing the fact that you paid a demand and it could impact coverage. I'm not a coverage expert. This hasn't happened to me, but it's this sort of rumor that I've heard. So I try to dissuade people from doing that for that reason. And then the other piece, while in my experience, I don't see companies get re-attacked by the same threat actor group. The only times I see clients have a succession of ransomware attacks is if there's a vulnerability, they don't address the vulnerability, another group will take advantage of it. If you came out and made a statement that you paid a demand, it could potentially make you a target in the future for other groups that say, oh, you paid once, you'll pay again. And that's why for all those reasons, is why we generally advise folks to keep it tight-lipped in terms of whether or not a payment's been made. Got
it. Jack, can I ask for your response to that? And in your experience, what drives the decision? What Sara was saying, does that resonate with you in your experience?
It absolutely does, and I completely agree. So the backups being one fantastic point, and to even elaborate a little bit further, I think it's also amusing that when we do get access to the decryptor, they don't tend to be written quite as effectively as the encrypting tools themselves, and they do take an awful lot longer to decrypt the information that's available to us. I also think that's a fantastic point about the sensitive information being released potentially to the threat actor leak site. The other two that I'd like to add there are that we also start to see more denial of service attacks being posed against organizations when they are victim to these ransomware groups. And on the second point there is that we tend to see the next extortion method, which is where they're getting access to the customer contact details, the contact details of the C-suite and others within the organization, and they're actually then making phone calls or sending them emails or even sending them voice notes and trying to extort money from these organizations. So what we're starting to see is this kind of quadruple extortion of where we've lost access to the information itself through ransom. We're then seeing posting potentially of the information to the threat actor leak sites, DOS attacks being performed against their operations to prevent them from being able to operate even if they get their systems back online, and then followed up with the communications with the teams as well. So yeah, those are the things that tend to take the decision making for what in my experience.
So Jack, the DOS attacks and the follow-up extortion, if you will, is that from the same actors who perpetrated the initial incident?
Yeah, absolutely. They're all happening as part of the original incidents themselves.
Okay. People often talk about how there's some honor among thieves in this business, that it's bad for the business model if ransomware threat actors attack the company again. But it sounds like you're saying you do see it. Is that, how often,
Sometimes these can even just be part of the ransom itself. So if they have managed to recover from backups and then they've not paid the ransom, there's still then the threat of them having that access to the information that they've potentially exfiltrated. So that's when we start to see the second part of the extortion taking place. And if then, even when they've posted the information, that the information is then available online, if the actor is really determined, and we've seen this in a couple of instances, they will then start to perform these denial of service attacks to really try and ramp up the extortion that is taking place, and it all takes place as part of that attack itself.
Got it. Sara, you made the point that you both made the point that recovery, even with the decryptor key, takes longer than companies may appreciate. You, either of you or both of you, elaborate on that a little bit? I think companies are really interested to understand the timing of recovery, if they pay, if they don't pay.
Sure. So, I mean, in my experience, the decryptor tool can take just as long, if not longer, than restoring from backups. And I think that one of the reasons Jack mentioned earlier is it's not developed very well. It's not necessarily a reliable tool. It's not going to work to decrypt all the systems that you may have or the way that you've organized your data. So I think that does surprise a lot of organizations, that it's just not a silver bullet. And Jack, I don't know, other thoughts that you have on that?
Yeah, I think so. So one thing, when we get access to the decryptor, one of the things that we always do is we go and actually check that it operates in the manner that we've been promised that it will, because we are dealing with criminals at the end of the day. And the second piece that I wanted to add, with regard to restoring from backups, and even when we've decrypted those files, there's still a level of validation that we need to go and do. And I call it a sheep dipping process, but the idea being that we take information from a dirty state, and we need to ensure that all of those systems, as part of a ransomware attack where they've been accessed by a threat actor, are actually clean at the end of the process. Because it's all very well that we go and get their access back to the information, so availability of information has been confirmed. But what we also need to verify is the integrity of that information and make sure that the threat actor hasn't put themselves in further access methodologies or persistence methodologies to ensure they can potentially come back again in the future.
So is this a process of days? Is it a process of weeks? Does it depend? What's your experience?
In my experience, it depends very much on the size of the organization, but also on the maturity. To the point of organizations having backup plans, it's fantastic when they do have backup plans, and they also have backup infrastructure in place. But if they don't frequently test it and it comes back to preparation, if they don't test it, then they're not going to know, A, how to restore from ground zero and restore their entire organization from backups, and B, how long that might take.
Very good. One last question. I was going to move to a new topic, but I think we're short on time. So people worry, what if the backups get infected? How real a risk is that? Have you all seen that in your practice?
Yes.
Yeah.
So important to test and check on in advance.
And I've also seen them get deleted by the threat actor. Yeah. So testing and making sure the configurations there's appropriate segmentation is critical.
And going quickly back to making sure those backups are viable, because if the threat actor has been in the network for a large period of time, one of the things as part of the forensic analysis work stream of ransomware response is actually working our way back to identify which is the first backup that actually hasn't been affected by the threat actor, or where there hasn't been access to those systems, and that can take a significant period of time.
Sara, Jack, thank you so much for your time today. Really interesting and helpful. We very much appreciate you joining us.
Hey, yes, thank you, Sara and Jack, and thank you, Nikki, for doing a great job leading the discussion. We really appreciate it.